to it. Frankly, we don't like Ohio either. And as a guy from Michigan, Chris, you know, we'll take Indiana any day of the week. Wisconsin is fine. We're separated by a body of water, but yeah, nobody in Michigan likes Ohio.
Welcome to Canusa Street, a podcast at the intersection of the issues and policies between Canada and the United States. Here are your hosts, Scotty Greenwood and Chris Sands.
Welcome back to Canusa Street. I'm Scotty Greenwood with the Canadian American Business Council, and I'm joined by my great colleague, Chris Sands with the Wilson Center.
Hello. Nice to be with you, Scotty.
Great to be with you. As always, on Canusa Street, Chris, we have a terrific, timely podcast today. We're honored to be joined by a great member of Congress who happens to live on the northern border, Congressman Bill Huizenga, and we're going to talk about a whole host of things that are on his mind and on all of our minds right now. But before we get to the dialogue, Chris, maybe you could introduce our esteemed guest properly.
Sure. Well, it's an honor. Bill Huizenga represents Michigan's 2nd congressional district, and as a Michigander myself, I know that is on the shores of Lake Michigan, roughly from Holland to Ludington. So he's a border stater, but not actually representing a district that connects to the border, right? For those of you who are listening on the podcast, the congressman was showing us where on the hand he is. That's one of those weird Michigan things we all do. So Congressman Huizenga has been serving in Congress since 2010. It's his 6th term. He has been a leader on the House Financial Services Committee. He has been looking at trade. He's got a real focus on investor protection, entrepreneurship, capital markets, and really one of the most economically savvy and sophisticated members of Congress that we have. So really great to have you. Also, I should mention, Congressman, you are part of the Northern Border Caucus, which really represents or reflects your leadership on these issues. So welcome.
Well, thanks, and very good to be with you. And with that kind of introduction, I think you could easily slide into the lobbying community. I mean, that was as good a full butter up as I've ever heard. But no, in all seriousness, this is important, and I really do appreciate the opportunity to join with you and share some experiences. And you know, a lot of people don't realize in Michigan we don't just go north to Canada; we actually go east to Canada. If you've looked up my bio at all, some might know that my wife is from the Toronto area originally. And so this hits close to home, literally for us as a family, having the ability to move back and forth across the border. And we go due east when we go to visit her family. You know, I appreciate your attempt to draw some attention to these important issues. You know, so much focus is on the southern border, both the negative and the positive. And people forget that this is the largest trading partnership in the entire world, this U.S. Canadian partnership and the trade agreements that we have. And this might be a little bit of a stale statistic, but I think it at least gives some scope. If the state of Michigan was an independent trading partner with Canada, it would be something like the 6th largest trading partnership in the entire world. And a lot of that goes to our automotive, our manufacturing, and our agriculture. And it's a significant and very important relationship. And I just want to make sure that as we're all working through on both sides of the aisle, the quote unquote COVID protocols, I want to make sure that that's not getting lost.
Congressman, that's a great point and a perfect segue to something we wanted to ask you about. You embody Canada-U.S. relations, as you mentioned, with your own family, your wife's family, and your family, and the economic relationship is unparalleled. One of the things related to all of that, one of the things I wanted to start off and kind of understand from you is you have been a strong advocate for reopening the Canada-U.S. border. Canada, as we know, opened to fully vaccinated Americans in early August. The U.S. hasn't reciprocated. And in a day and a time in Washington, D.C., where there isn't a lot of bipartisanship, you and your Democratic colleague, you're on the Republican side, Congressman Higgins on the Democratic side, you and 70 other colleagues joined together to really urge the Biden administration to take a look in a science-based and safe way at reopening our border for the sake of families, like we said, and for the sake of the economy. So I wanted to maybe start with you talking a little bit about that. What drove you to join in on that? And are you hopeful that come the next renewal decision that the border will be reopened, or are you less hopeful?
Yeah, let me first say Brian Higgins and I have been a great partnership, and he's a good friend, and he's been a great leader on this, and he represents the Buffalo, Niagara region. Quite honestly, he's been more harsh publicly than I have been on the administration, and it's because he has seen it and firsthand for himself as well in that area. I think, though, and having had some experience with this in the last administration, when you're on the same team, you're wearing the same jersey, at least theoretically, it is even more frustrating when you aren't getting communicated with. And when you are communicated with, it feels pedantic and fake. And if you listen to Brian, like I said, he's had some very harsh words for this administration and the decision making. And what we both have heard privately is that this is frankly an effect from the debacle that's happening at the southern border, and that somehow the White House doesn't want to draw attention to the southern border with dealing with the northern border in a quote unquote less strict way. And my point to some of my contacts has been, I'm not sure how you're hiding behind this by not having commonality at the northern border. I mean, I don't think that has somehow diminished criticism about what's been happening at the southern border. In fact, I think it's actually amplified it because, here you have a good faith partner in the Canadian government that is trying to advance this and move it forward, and they're getting stiff-armed. And it wasn't that long ago when this modification came from the Canadian government that there was a serious discussion and requests of, hey, maybe the U.S. should just unilaterally open up its border, and it's going to put pressure on the Trudeau camp to then force their hand and open up the Canadian border. And I said at the time, I didn't think that was a good idea because it makes far more sense to me that we advance in lockstep and that we have common policies at the border, not differing policies. And then lo and behold, it flip-flopped, right? The Canadians ended up, after getting some significant pushback, the Canadian government decided to loosen up some of those restrictions. And then we found the Biden administration doubling down on it. And so, again, I think that sort of underscores the shall we say, less than common sense stance that is happening. I think I am a little more charitable than my friend Brian, who called it total BS, not using the acronym BS. But that's the kind of the frustration people have, is they don't see consistency in this. And it's not like the science is different on the Canadian side of the border than it is on the Michigan side of the border or in the New York side of the border. It ought to be easier to come to a common understanding. But apparently that's where the political comes in, and that's a frustration.
Yeah, totally frustrated too. Totally agree with you. And it's not a partisan thing to say that. It's just, if you're going to open the border based on science and all of that, then do that. Let me ask one thing before I turn it over to Chris. One more thing related to Canada and the United States approaching common issues together, including border management. One of the other great Michigan issues is this Line 5, this Enbridge pipeline that goes from Canada through the Straits of Mackinac back into Canada, but happens to provide jet fuel to the Detroit airport and home heating propane to a lot of Michiganders in the upper and lower peninsula. So I wonder if you've got some thoughts on that, because it seems to me that's another area where, notwithstanding an international treaty and several decades of collaboration, we seem to be diverging. Does that worry you?
It's a very emotional subject in Michigan, and as co-chair of the Great Lakes Task Force and someone who has worked on Great Lakes issues for a very long time, it has a lot of people worried. And now part of that is maybe a lack of understanding of what it actually is and what it does and what it means. I can tell you that this is one of those things that also crosses party lines and philosophical lines in many ways. Is this desire to make sure that we are protecting the Great Lakes? But as you rightly point out, there are significant issues attached to this. If that Line 5 was to go away or was to be stopped right immediately without any sort of contingency plan. And I can tell you that it's been laid out, at least for me, that could mean a version of a Great Lakes oil tanker being on the Great Lakes and susceptible to storms and weather and things like that. And the practical side is, how do you deliver in both directions the products that are needed, both in the Upper Peninsula, or as we call it here in Michigan, the UP, and in the Lower Peninsula? And we're very interconnected that way. So I think the governor's stance and the attorney general's stance here in Michigan is equally at least about politics as it is about the policy side of this. That certainly has made it far more difficult. And as I try to explain to people down here in Michigan, I mean, I know from personal experience and someone who's worked on policy, there's not a country that's much more environmentally sensitive than Canada as a whole. And if they really truly didn't believe that they could do this safely, they wouldn't move forward. Now, opponents of that would point out what happened with Enbridge down on the Kalamazoo River a number of years ago, and with that spill that happened out of one of their pipelines, which was significant and very problematic, and they had some heavy fines and obviously heavy cleanup costs. But I don't know. There's not a perfect answer on this. I do want to make sure that it's as safe as humanly possible. And some people believe that drilling this tunnel underneath the Straits of Mackinac is safe, and others just don't buy that. And again, it's hard to separate. Just like we were talking about with COVID, it's hard to separate that science and the physical side from the emotional side with it. So, I think we have not found that perfect answer, but it looks like it's going to be moving forward. I think the job then of the all levels of government is to make sure it is done in safe a manner as possible until there's an alternative that's found. And at this point, I don't see one.
Well, that gives me a jumping off point. And I'll apologize. I'm also a Michigander, but I'm going to ask this question because I sometimes get it from friends of mine in Canada, which is, what does Michigan have against Canada? Now, I know you don't have anything against Canada. You've got Canadian relatives, but we had the big debate over building the Gordie Howe Bridge, and there were referenda, and it looked like the Michigan legislature couldn't support Michigan paying its share of the bridge. Now we have Enbridge Line 5, and we have this continually shut border. Is there like some sort of anti-Canadian movement in Michigan? Just from the outside, I think some people wonder, because it just comes up again and again, that Canada doesn't feel like they get a fair hearing or a fair shake, and that populists kind of make them out to be some sort of monsters that they're not. But you're sensitive on both sides. What's going on with Canada and Michigan these days?
Well, Chris, we know that their beer sucks, and they're very sensitive about that. No, okay. For those of you, I am totally kidding. That's an old joke going back to the movie Canadian Bacon with
That's right.
That's how John Candy starts a riot at a hockey game. Is he yells out, "This beer sucks." Sorry, I don't know exactly who the audience is. Hopefully they've got a good sense of humor.
Definitely.
Appreciate the cultural reference, definitely.
Yeah, no, look, I think that there is a healthy skepticism of it. The bridge part, whether dealing with the Ambassador Bridge versus the Gordie Howe Bridge, the Detroit Tunnel, those access points, those pinch points that happen in Detroit have been a sore point for a very, very long time. And you look at it from the Canadian side and where the Ambassador Bridge dumps out into town, and some of the traffic issues that it causes has been something that's been maybe more to the attention on the Canadian side in Windsor than it has been on the U.S. side in Detroit. I don't see that there's an unhealthy aspect to it. Frankly, we don't like Ohio either. So maybe it's a, and as a guy from Michigan, Chris, we'll take Indiana any day of the week. Wisconsin is fine. We're separated by a body of water, but nobody in Michigan likes Ohio.
Oh no, you're going to get us in so much trouble, Congressman.
Yeah, direct the hate mail to me. Let's see.
But let me then take it in a slightly different direction, because I know you focus on a lot of small business and entrepreneurial issues, and there is also a sense in this border restriction that there's a two-tier border. GM and Ford and Chrysler, they can move their stuff across the border, but if you're a small business, and so many small businesses are involved in tourism, hospitality, etc., from your state government or your county or your city, you get a phase-out plan. You're under these restrictions, and this is when we're going to open back up. It may not be what you want, but at least you get clear communication. But on the border, first of all the business that relies on cross-border shoppers and tourists, and you're in a beautiful part of Michigan, and you do get Canadian tourists who come over for those sorts of things, you're not getting communicated with, and you're not getting a phase-out plan from the government. And I wonder, well, the longer question is, if we're not interacting at festivals and on the beaches and enjoying each other's company, then how can we ever feel like we're understanding each other, because we're not having those conversations? But can you talk a little bit about that sense that some people, if you're in the wrong sector, you're getting more affected by restrictions than if you're GM and Ford, who usually get their way?
Yeah, you are absolutely right about that. We have seen the, quote, essential trade element continue. Manufacturing, agriculture, we've made it work, which again underscores how nonsensical it is that we can't have others. If you're a truck driver with a vaccine, how is that different than being a tourist with a vaccine, right? Mm-hmm. Or immunities, I should say, at least. And that two-tier unequal policy or view of the world is a huge part of the frustration that so many people have. Pure Michigan has been a very, very successful marketing campaign for tourism here in Michigan. And Michigan Tourism Association has an estimate that until recently, till pre-COVID, 1 in 5 golfers in northern Michigan were actually from Canada. All right. Think about that. And there is nothing quite like Michigan golf in the summertime, especially. And that's 20% of the business coming across the border. Now, that's then you go to these cities, whether it's Sault Ste. Marie up in the Upper Peninsula, whether it's Port Huron and Sarnia in that Thumb region, or Detroit and Windsor. This is not just an economic blending of our two cities and two countries. It's a cultural one. It's familial, and we really are losing out on that. And all of those small businesses that are dependent on people coming both ways across the border to whether it's go to a casino or go to a concert or go to a show or go to a sporting event. I can tell you that there's a lot of folks in Toronto that are Buffalo Bills fans. Frankly, it's sometimes a struggle as a guy from Michigan to be a Lions fan. Just look at their look at their record lately, and I love the Lions. But you have these loyalties that sports team loyalties and cultural loyalties, and we're really losing out on that. And the economic impact is huge. And so just like everything else in life, and I don't care if it's in a think tank or in a business association or in your place of worship or in your own family, you need relationships to build trust, and you need trust to figure out solutions when problems occur. And right now, I think that trust level has actually deteriorated based on some of those decisions. And that's been something that we that have been involved in U.S. Canada relations. I'm chair of the IPG, which is the Interparliamentary Group. It's the U.S. Delegation and the Canadian Parliament. We're the official organization that is in charge of some of those relationships between MPs and members of Congress, whether it's that or the Northern Border Caucus or the Great Lakes Task Forces. We've been trying to have communications with our Canadian counterparts. And, we're really losing out on something here when we don't have that ability to really connect. Zoom is fine temporarily, but you lose, and again, I don't care if you're in a think tank or a business association, you lose a culture. When you can't be together and can't break bread, you can't share a beer, even a Canadian beer, good Canadian. You can't spend that time and really build those relationships.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, that's absolutely right. And one other thought here is it's not just about what the federal governments a year and a half ago deemed as essential, which is basically grocery stores. If it stocks a grocery shelf or if it's part of a manufacturing, they recognize it's not just that or tourism. There is a whole bunch of business that occurs where people need to travel back and forth. The professional services business. Some of the members of the Canadian American Business Council are AI companies, for example, and people are their key business in terms of establishing the relationships back and forth with their customers. People are their supply chain, they like to say. And so for that, and for all the reasons you mentioned, we've got to get back to a place where we can travel. I guess I'll just ask you one more thing, Congressman, building on what you were saying. People needing to break bread. Assuming that Canada remains open to fully vaccinated Americans, can you imagine perhaps sometime in the next, year or so, participating or leading a CODEL, what we call CODELs, a congressional delegation trip up to Canada? Is that because I know that's something that is helpful, showing up, learning, and unfortunately the U.S. can't. Well, I guess you could get some exemptions, but the U.S. can't really accept Canadians unless they fly in. They can't travel across the border. But would you consider going to Canada if the right opportunity presented itself and bringing some of your colleagues up there?
Oh, absolutely. And by the way, that is one of those inconsistencies that doesn't make sense. And it drives people nuts. Literally, you can fly into the country, but you can't drive into the country. So I know of people who are flying from Toronto into Detroit rather than driving the 3 hours, or from Hamilton and London and other places like that. They're actually driving the opposite direction to get on a plane at Pearson and fly into Detroit Metro. But yes, absolutely. It's been far too long. A few years ago, we did a joint U.S. Senate IPG trip to Ottawa. And we are in desperate need of that. The Canadians, and this is interesting, that Canadian MPs actually are granted a certain number of trips down to DC in their budget, in their office budget. For us, because it's, quote, international travel, we have to get this approved by various committees. Even though it's a neighboring country with direct flights that would be very, very easy, we have to get official formal permission, and it's not just an automatically assumed thing. But yes, we have been talking about getting back up to Canada. The Canadians come down to the U.S. on a regular basis. We need to reciprocate and get our folks up there to make sure that we understand what's happening in Canada. And obviously, with the elections that are the snap election that was called by Trudeau a few weeks ago, that's going to be a different flavor, and we'll see what happens with the government structure up there. And I think it's incumbent upon us to make sure that we get back up soon.
That's music to our ears. Look, I know you're really pressed for time. You've been so generous. Let me actually wrap on one last question that we haven't touched on, because I think you're leaving for a briefing on Afghanistan. The U.S. is officially out. A policy that a lot of people, I think, could agree with, yet the execution of it is something that is quite challenging. Canada was part of that mission with the U.S. shoulder to shoulder for many years. I wonder if you just want to share with us, Congressman, your thoughts about where we are with Afghanistan and what the future is.
Well, way too many people have conflated Iraq and Afghanistan, and they have to remember why we were in Afghanistan and why NATO was in Afghanistan and why there was a 40-plus country coalition that was in Afghanistan. It's because they harbored Osama bin Laden and others with Al-Qaeda and other organizations, and they were a breeding ground for terrorism. It's not so much the issue about whether we were leaving or not leaving or what presence we were going to have, but it's the how do we get out of there. And this was not the way to do it. I will tell you, my office, along with every other Republican and Democrat congressional office, has received calls from our constituents who are trapped there or have family members there, or have relationships with those special immigrant visas, those SIV holders. They're the translators, they're the assistants that were there helping NATO, and it is tragic and morally unacceptable, in my opinion, what has been done to those folks. And I'll leave you with this one quick story. We have a SIV, the special immigrant visa holder, who was an interpreter for the Afghan forces and U.S. forces. He is here in my district. He has a fiance who had all of her paperwork at the U.S. Embassy, her passport, her Afghan passport, her visa that was in process and was getting approved, all of her paperwork. And when the U.S. Abandoned the embassy, and I will use that word, abandoned the embassy, they destroyed all of that paperwork, all of it. And she is now stuck. She has attempted 3 times to get to the airport. She has an email from the State Department saying, come to the airport. We know who you are. We will get you out of the country. The last time, she was beaten so badly by the Taliban that she had to seek medical treatment. And she was calling her fiance yesterday, who was then calling our office and saying to him, I'm seeing all these airplanes leave. I don't see any soldiers around. Are they going to abandon me? And this poor guy was literally calling every 30 to 45 minutes in tears, trying to figure out what he could do for his fiance, who is now stuck with no paperwork, no passport, and no ability to get out of the country, even to a third-party country, because of what we've done. This was the wrong way to exit. We did not take care of our citizens or our allies in a way that we should have, in my opinion. And I think that there's going to be some very, very hard questions asked on both sides of the aisle, because I can tell you, talking to my Democrat colleagues, they're just as angry about this because they're receiving the same and similar calls from their constituents, and people are not happy about it, nor should they be.
And I just can't resist mentioning this. As Scotty said, we were in Afghanistan together with the Canadians, and I think one of the things that's got a lot of Canadians worried is they were really counting on us to help get their people out too. And the Allied coordination, we've heard it at NATO meetings and so on, has not been great. And I hope we learned something from this. Once we fixed it in the first place, maybe learn something and never do this again. We can't abandon our people. We also shouldn't be leaving our allies without communication.
Well, amen, Chris. And the question is, who is going to trust us in the future? You know, whether it's the equivalent of Afghan allies, wherever it might be in the world, because, you know, this is not the end of the war, because this global war on terror is going to be ongoing. And so whether it's our much more formalized and structured NATO allies, or whether it's other allies that we may not even know are allies quite yet, there is a huge trust deficit right now. And that's going to be falling on this administration. And there's going to have to be some serious questions asked, and we better get good answers. But I'm afraid there's very few good answers.
Well, and that just reminds me how fortunate, if I may say that, we are in the United States and Canada to have each other in our neighborhood, because, you know, you think about Pakistan and Afghanistan, you think about so many other international neighborhoods and boundaries and how challenging it is. And so it's important for us not to take here in North America, not to take each other for granted, so that we can hopefully confront some of these bigger global challenges together. Anyway, with that, Congressman, we'll give you the last word, and we're thankful to you for spending some time with us here today.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity, and Scotty, on that note, you're right. This is more than just an economic relationship that we have with our neighbors. This is a cultural and societal connection, and we've got to preserve it. We've got to fight for that. We've got to make sure that it is there and that it doesn't diminish. And so I appreciate your efforts in making those connections, and I'm pleased to be a small part of it.
You're a big part of it, Congressman. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
All right, we'll talk to you soon.
Well, Chris, what a phenomenal conversation with Congressman Huizenga. You know, he is passionate about a number of things that have to do with Canada-U.S. relations. He's married to a Canadian, and he spends a fair amount of his time in advocacy, not just on the border, but on the economic relationship. And what he said is he'd like to, as co-chair of the Interparliamentary Group, he'd like to get back up there to Canada. So I think we should follow right up on that and see if we can get a trip organized to take a bunch of members north of the border. What do you think?
I think it's a great idea. And it's also, for me, it's a reminder that there are friends of Canada who many Canadians and a lot of Americans don't know. Congressman Huizenga is not a household name, probably too far outside Michigan. He's not an actual border rep, so he's from the other side of the state. And yet his passion and his ideas really deserve a better hearing. I think Canadians would be surprised to maybe find they've got more friends in Congress, more friends away from the border than they realize.
That's exactly right. Well, anyway, great to have our members of Congress joining us on Canusa Street, from Brian Higgins to Susan DelBene to Congressman Bill Huizenga. We're on a roll here, Chris, and it's not just the policymakers, but we have the private sector leaders, the civil society leaders, and I'm so pleased to be on this adventure with you. I think it couldn't be more important right now in Canada-U.S. relations.
No, there's a lot of traffic on this street, and we're getting great people walking it with us, so I appreciate that too.
All right, we'll see you next time.
All right, thank you.
This podcast is brought to you by the Canadian American Business Council and the Wilson Center. If you like this episode, help others find our show and give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify.